I want to welcome everybody on behalf of the Carter Center and the North Carolina Coalition for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. And we are really pleased to have the partners we have helping with tonight's event. As you know, this is the 14th town hall in our 15 town hall series, one of which is virtual. And we're really excited in Wilmington. Beautiful area, and excited to have our local experts. I'm Jennifer Roberts, and I'm a former mayor of Charlotte and a former county commissioner from Mecklenburg County. And we did have an event in Mecklenburg. It's a little different size, but the processes are the same. And so the partners I want to thank, first of all, the League of Women Voters. We have the League, of course, welcome you. Everybody heard the League, raise your hand. Yay, let's give them a big hand. Thanks. They have a tremendous Vote 411 resource, which is really helpful. In North Carolina, because we're such a fast-growing state, a lot of what's happening in elections is confusing. District lines keep changing. I haven't moved in 30 years. I've been in 3 different congressional districts. Maybe some of you are the same. So we really appreciate that resource. And our second big co-sponsor is the U.S. Veterans Hall of Fame. They work very hard to get resources to veterans, including helping them learn about voting when they return, and even when they're overseas, because there's a whole process there too. So any veterans want to raise your hand? Thank you for your service. You're here, Bob. It's been veteran. So this project has been initiated by the Carter Center. The Carter Center has 4 decades of experience working with elections around the world, helping support democracy in places like Ethiopia, Sudan, Mali. And in 2020, they started looking at the US and said, we should bring our expertise here. That being said, the effort we're making in North Carolina is very locally based. One of the things we've learned is that each state is different in the way it runs its elections. So Bob Orr and I'll introduce Bob in a minute, and David Capeman, the third person on our team, are helping to get the message out in North Carolina that our elections are fair, safe, and secure. We're trying to get good information in front of people to counter the misinformation and I think just confusion that we have around our elections. So we appreciate everybody being part of that, appreciate the Carter Center's work, and are glad that they're doing work in North Carolina, one of 4 pilot states. And so we are leading in gathering information about what really does help, what works to get good information out and keep our elections peaceful. So we can feel proud of that leadership here in North Carolina. With that, I'm going to introduce my colleague in this town hall tour. We've been through what, 5 weeks of this, and we're still really happy. We still like each other. And Bob Orr is a former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice. He was also on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. He's a U.S. Army veteran. And my favorite part is he had both his undergrad and graduate degree from UNC Chapel Hill. Go Heels. Join me in welcoming Bob Orr.
Yeah, I have to say, I was as tall as Jennifer when we started. It has been a struggle. It's been great. It's a privilege to work with Jennifer in the Carter Center on this, and it's always fun to be back in Wilmington. I was married here 31 years ago, so I have lots of happy memories, and every summer we're back at Whitesville Beach. So thanks for coming out, and thanks for being part of this. I want to take just a couple of minutes, sort of set the stage for the discussion, and also talk about elections in North Carolina, a little bit of history. So that it was December of 1776, about 170 miles north of here, that the framers of the North Carolina Constitution met in Halifax to establish for the very first time a representative democracy for the people of this state. A foundational principle of their efforts, as set out in the Declaration of Rights, was a system of elections. Now, over the course of these last 246 years, that foundational concept of elections by the people has undergone enormous changes. Changes that have strengthened and expanded the voting franchise, provided greater security for the electoral process, and expanded the scope of public officials that we elect. The democratic principle of election by the people is the fundamental foundation upon which our government and our democracy are built. Now, today we have over 7,345,000 registered voters across the 100 counties of this state. We have professional staffers hired at the state level and local professional staffers hired by each county board of elections to administer these elections. And in an election year, some 25,000 other individuals of all political persuasions, our friends and our neighbors, work the polls over the course of this election period. The professional staff handles candidate filings and preparation of ballots, while these non-staff individuals assist with pre-election day activities like early voting, absentee ballot requests and submissions, in addition to election day voting and the tabulation of votes, all of which lead to the certification of the election results. These Herculean tasks, and it is a Herculean task, are accomplished within a framework of laws enacted over the years by the North Carolina legislature and regulations consistent with those laws as enacted by the State Board of Elections. And we have a comprehensive set of security measures in place to protect your right to vote and the accurate tabulation of those votes to determine election winners. And there are specific legal procedures in place to allow challenges and complaints if any citizen feels that a violation of the law has taken place. And many people may take voting for granted, but as former President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, the future of this republic is in the hands of the American voter. Our election officials, from Murphy to Manteo, from Windsor to Wilmington, from Burnsville to Burlington, work relentlessly to make sure that our elections, so vital to American democracy, proceed fairly, safely, and securely. And tonight, we're going to hear how they work to make that happen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce a gentleman who needs no introduction to Wilmington. John Evans was here before the North Carolina Battleship show. He's been here a long time, but not quite that. John is in his 45th year of broadcasting, his 30th year of covering news in the Wilmington market. He's anchored or co-anchored 4 weekday newscasts for WECT. He's also the station's political director, leading coverage of local, state, and federal campaigns and elections. He moderates all sorts of political events sponsored by the station and is requested by community groups. And we're just honored and privileged, John, that you will join us tonight. Thank you very much.
Not to say that I've been here a while, but I went live when the battleship came in here. That's fun. I get a chance to do a lot of events, and I get a chance to do a lot of forums, and I get a chance to do a lot of town halls. And everybody says, it's part of your job, and to a point it is. But look, I learn just like everybody else does at these events. And if I can walk out of an event like this and be smarter because of it, then it's time well spent. Those of you who are here tonight, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to come out here and listen, and come out here and ask a question. And the audience will have a chance. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, Jennifer has cards here that you'll be able to ask, write down a question, and we'll be able to, as best our time allows, ask the panelists and ask the experts when it comes to their panel time. The first panel this evening we are doing is on election administration. And if you would like to have a card and write down a question, just kind of raise your hand, try to get somebody's attention. David's here, Jennifer's, or mine, and we'll try to get a card and a pencil over to you to write it down. Our first panel is on election administration. Before I introduce these experts, I'd like to have you give them a round of applause for taking this evening's time and the time they do every day to try to make sure that our elections are fair and honest. We're going to go from my far right all the way down here to the left. Ray Hunter Havens is the Director of Elections for New Hanover County, and she has held that position since 2017. Ray, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks very much. Next to Ray, we have Sarah Levier, the Director of Elections for Brunswick County. She has held that position for 8 years. And those of you who may be new to Southeastern North Carolina, and I'm going to kind of honor Sarah a little bit. She received an award, the Devote Award, last year for her efforts to ensure election integrity. And those of you who may not be familiar, she actually challenged her own mother's absentee ballot when her mother passed away prior to election day. So here's someone who had a personal experience, yet took the steps necessary to ensure election integrity. Sarah, we appreciate you being here this evening. Thank you. Randy Pelton is a Republican member of the Brunswick County Board of Elections, a professional telecommunications manager, consultant for 40 years, but has 20 years of elections experience with a background in all phases of elections process, from polling place to chairman of the Elections Board of Brunswick County. Randy, we appreciate your time. Thank you. Give Randy a round of applause if you would. And joining us, a Democratic member of the Board of Elections in Brunswick County, Boyd Williamson, was the tax administrator for the county for nearly 25 years, knows county government, and has served on the Brunswick County Board of Elections for a decade now, and has been the chairman of the board for the past 6 years. They are our esteemed panelists this evening. Give them all another round of applause if you would. You each have microphones, and you'll have to share microphones in front of you. We'll have our master technician come over and make sure the microphones are on. Once again, if you'd like to ask a question, please try to get Jennifer's attention, and we'll get a pencil to you, and we'll try to get a question, your question asked. But I'd like to start. We hear, and maybe Sarah and Ray can address this one first, is we hear, and we at WBCT and a lot of media outlets all across the state talk about the elections director and the board of elections. So Ray, I'm going to start with you if you can. Can you give us an idea of what the difference is in the responsibilities of an elections director and the position that these gentlemen hold as the board of elections?
Certainly. For the head of a county, one of the things that boards will often do when they're first sworn in is determine what duties, if any, they want to delegate to the director. In most counties, they will delegate the majority of those administrative tasks to the director, but the final board staff are not able to delegate their traditional functions. So the board is responsible for things such as voting, establishing stop sites. They are responsible for approving all of the absentee ballot applications, as well as the provisional applications of the election. And any time polling place changes, that's something, if there's going to be a change of precinct boundaries, those are the types of things that the board will need to take action on. And a very important component, of course, is the appointing of chief judges and judges, who are responsible really for managing the polling places on election day. So, ideally, the Hoffman County Board works with the director to really make certain that all of the responsibilities and the tasks are performed well and in service hopefully for all voters in the county.
Sarah, can you expand on that a little bit? And what is your daily, weekly interaction with the board when it comes to election integrity?
Really, the day-to-day functions of the Board of Elections are done by me and my staff. The board members really probably don't care that we received 20 voter registration applications in the mail and we opened them and scanned them in. So the day-to-day we really manage. Anything that comes down from the state regarding procedures, any of that is immediately forwarded to the board members so that they're aware of rules, policies, things like that. I touch base with the board as often as I need to. As we get into election season, it becomes more often, probably at least weekly. We're going to start absentee meetings, so I will see each of them happily every week to consider absentee ballots. So yeah.
Cool, thank you. And Boyd and Randy, how do you work? And there's one thing that both Bob and Jennifer asked to counter disinformation. Can one of you, what does the board do? What is a job of a board member to try to counter dis or misinformation out there about the integrity of, let's say in your instance, the Brunswick County Board of Elections?
Well, I would like to say one thing, John, before I go any farther. Without Ray and Sarah, the boards would be lost. These are the guys that really hold it all together, and they're the ones that deserve all the credit for every election that goes well. And as a board member, if there's an issue, I don't take responsibility for that. But these are the guys that really make it happen. As far as disinformation goes, we have all of our meetings are open to the public. Sarah and the board work very closely with any issue that comes up from any voter in the county. Just recently, we had a question about vote counts being changed in Brunswick County. We were able to demonstrate to those folks who have a concern that from the machine itself that tabulated the votes at the polling location to the process in the office on election night to the number that was reported by the state when it finally came out were all identical to the number. And I think that gives the voters, and in this particular case, the folks that had an issue were satisfied that we have secured the vote properly in Brunswick County, and that every vote counted, and the votes that were counted were all legitimate.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you. I see the role of the Board of Elections. You have the voting public and you have the staff. And then you have us. And we are the folks that are we're parts, we're appointed by a party. And we're the folks that are out in the county. We're probably connected somehow. It's for long-term relationships. They're pretty much in the office doing the day in and day out work. But it's by and large, people ask, call, or come to see us and they say, we have confidence in what's going on because we have confidence that y'all are doing what you're supposed to be doing and overseeing what's being done. Not that there's any that they need any oversight, but I give you an example of former county commissioner, a county attorney told us, is glad that, and I'm not giving myself an example, but I'm glad to know that you're there because I feel confident in the process that people like you are there and making sure that things are happening the way they should happen. And there's nothing out of no irregularities happening in the process, and that's what I see with the work.
One concern well, several concerns, but one I'm going to start with is what is allowed during early voting in North Carolina, and that's the availability for someone to register and vote on the same day. If they want to vote on election day, they have to register by 14th, is my correct? Am I right? Okay, cool. Same day registration. Sarah, I'm going to pick with you. Does that present challenges, and how do you overcome the challenges of somebody registering, already voting, and then what do you use to try to make sure they are who they say they are?
When someone uses the same day registration process at the early voting site, they are required to provide proof of residence. So they have to show a current driver's license with their name and address on it, a current utility bill, and current being within 90 days with the date on it. So they have to show something with their current residential address, but not mailing address, the actual house that they're trying to register at with their name. After they do that same day registration at the early voting site, all of that information is sent back to our office, and within 2 business days, we have to mail a registration card to that voter at their address to make sure that it gets there. That's kind of part of the consummation process of voter registration. We have to get mailed to the voter. And so we take part in that daily. We're getting the returns and the same day registration back from the early voting site. The voters are also providing driver's license number, last word social security number. So we're checking that against the DMV database and the Social Security Administration to make sure that everything matches up. Voter's name, voter's date of birth, and the identification number they provided.
Ray, do those steps? It sounds cumbersome. But are they effective in your mind?
I think they are effective. Do you know that there are some steps that, you know, to have the ability to do that same day registration? As Sarah mentioned, they have to show proof of residence, and then we also have to be able to verify that we can get mail to them at that residential address. And the safeguard in place for that is that they are voting a retrievable ballot. Unlike election day, where someone's pre-registered there, you know, that's not retrievable. There's something that would identify a person with a specific ballot. Whereas when you vote at one stop, every voter has sort of an absentee number, because one stop essentially is absentee, but it's in-person absentee. They're going to be absent from the polls on election day. So there is a retrievable absentee number that we can use if for some reason their driver's license or the social do not verify. If we cannot get mail to them, if there's something that would perhaps cause that one-stop ballot to be challenged, we would have the ability to retrieve that ballot. So I think everything that's in place there makes it a very effective process, but yet has essential safeguards in place to avoid it being misused by voters who are trying to use the system first.
We have a question asked by someone in the audience, and I'll let whoever would like to respond to this. This person says, I worked as a judge this past election. A lot of voters wanted to give me their ID, which I declined. What do you say to a voter to give them confidence to vote without voter ID? Which has been a contentious point in North Carolina and is still being played out in the legal and justice system. Sarah.
So as an election administrator, I don't have an opinion about whether ID should be provided or not. And so our election officials are trained to simply say to the voter, thank you, photo ID is not required to vote in this election. When we come in and we do our job, we aren't supposed to have opinions about things that may go before the courts or legislation that they pass. So, you know, if photo ID comes, great, we're ready to handle it. The board members may have differing opinions about photo ID, but really when a person checks in, they are providing their name, their residential address, they are signing a form under penalty of perjury that they are who they say they are, they're eligible to vote. And if it were brought to light that they signed that falsely, I know that I can't speak for everyone, but we send that to the state. The state can refer it to the district attorney, and people get, you know, they get in trouble. They get grand juried and things like that. So, I mean, end result, it may not fix it on election day, but end result, there are consequences when people do something.
Randy, do you want to add to it?
Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the process that Sarah was described is what was directed by the state board and what we were required to follow. As Sarah said, as an administrator, she's neutral. Boyd and I are both political appointees. Obviously, we have opinions. As a professional who at one time was a professional auditor, I think in my professional auditing opinion, there is an issue with not having voter ID, but that's a whole nother subject that's in the courts. But as Sarah described, you know, what we tell the folks is exactly what the state is telling us to tell them. Not the exactly words, but You know, yes, we realize you have an ID, you know, we can't ask for it, and if they try to hand it to us, we just politely say thank you and go by the state, your name, address, and so on and so forth.
We have another question here. Board,
I was just going to say, the staff, board election staff and board and boards, are basically bound to three, restrictions. One is, state board policy, and they send that, they hand out policy all the time. We get memos all the time, constantly, about policy. The second issue is the North Carolina General Statute. So obviously we have to follow the statutes. And the third issue is state law, is a case law that has come down since statutes were initiated. And probably case law is the situation where voter ID is not required. So we have limitations of what we're allowed to do and not do, and it's obviously statewide. So we have our limitations, regardless. We have a lot of latitude in other areas, but in those areas we have no latitude.
Ray, I'm going to ask you this question, and I must admit I can't make out a little bit of the writing, but hopefully the gist of the question will come across to you. Are the current voting systems, is it S4S?
Yes.
Yes, and that.
Yes, and that?
Yes. That's what, yes. Are they certified by the State Board of Elections? And do you know who does the certification?
Yes, any equipment that is used in North Carolina must be certified by the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Right now, there are two vendors primarily, Harts. There's Civic, which I think Sarah's, county uses. That's the vendor that they use to purchase their equipment. Or ES&S, which is election system and software. That is the equipment that we use in Hanover County. But all voting equipment has been certified by the North Carolina State Board of Elections.
And correct me if I'm wrong. I had heard someone ask to see and have the machine opened prior to an election happening, so somebody can see that there's no devices inside.
No, voting equipment in North Carolina, we do not use modems, but we're not able to provide access to our voting equipment for any member of the public or anyone really.
And once they are opened, do they not have to then be recertified again?
They'd have to either be recertified or in some sense repurchased. Do you know what I mean? Because you compromise the integrity of that system. So, physical security of voting equipment is critical, and which is why it's very limited access to it.
Boyd, can you give folks a better idea of provisional ballots? They hear about absentee and they hear about one-stop voting, but what is the process? And am I correct in saying that's one of the big steps that board members do when it comes to provisional ballots being cast and looked at and approved or declined, correct?
That's correct. And we as a board approve or decline every provisional ballot based on whether it's approvable or not approvable. By and large, most of the provisional ballots, and I think Sarah can attest to this, most of the provisional ballots are election day out of precinct, and there's a ton of them. And then you have every other situation, the other county, this and that, the other, not registered, all kinds of reasons to turn out. We try to find every reason to count every vote. But obviously, if you're not, if you're registered in another county, or if you got issues with something, then we can't count your vote. You need to know that you have to cross all the T's and dot all the I's before your vote's counted. And out of precinct, fortunately, is a reason that we can count your vote.
Another question asked by the audience: in the event that someone or a group attempts to disrupt at an early vote or election day site, what arrangements have been made in advance to try to prevent something like that? Sarah, you're shaking your head.
Before every election, I think it's safe to say that most county directors have reached out to emergency management, to their local law enforcement officers, and agencies to let them know, hey, there's an election coming. These are our early voting sites. These are the hours that we have early voting going on. Really, it's not to get first dibs if we need help, but it's to make them aware that, you know, these areas, if something does come up, would be a place that they would need to send somebody. So we make those arrangements ahead of time. The answer really simple is if something is severe and the chief judge cannot get what's happening at a location under control, they call 911 just like anybody else would to try to get some assistance from law enforcement.
So if someone is at a site and feels intimidated, feels like they are being, you know, looked at in a way that they feel threatened, their process should be.
A voter, we're talking about
Yes,
voters.
voter.
So if a voter has that experience, they can certainly bring it to the chief judge or the lead worker during early voting. That lead worker then makes a judgment call because they're probably seeing it, and they either call me and ask me for advice, or if it is a serious situation, they're instructed to call 911.
Right, why not just use paper ballots?
In terms of, we do use paper ballots, in
Okay.
terms of,
Well, there are some elections where electronic voting, because I voted electronically in the past, so why not just use paper ballots and eliminate the potential for any problems with transmission, anything with electronics, because let's face it, we all have electronic problems at some point in time around our home.
so you're referencing using paper ballots as opposed to, sort of, direct touch voting?
Correct, yes,
Okay.
yes.
In some cases, larger counties like Mecklenburg had chose to do all direct, records with electronic, voting equipment, simply because of their sheer size. They're trying to manage the number of pre-printed ballots and various ballot styles and make sure that each of the one stops have a certain specific number of them. Logistically, it's extremely challenging. It was challenging for us in Hanover, and we have 43 precincts and 175,000 people on average, a little more now. So I can only imagine if you exponentially increase that for counties like Mecklenburg, it would be extremely difficult. So I think for them, you know, using a different system for voting made more sense. And clearly their board felt that that was the appropriate choice. You know, certainly, you know, paper ballots, you do have that retrievable ballot. Do you know what I mean? So if there is some question with the voting equipment, you certainly can go back and look at those paper ballots. You know, in New Hampshire, we had a hand-eye recount. And certainly having those paper ballots is very helpful, but even having said that, there are sort of records of ballots you can get with different equipment. So there is redundancy there, and there are safeguards in place, even with a different system.
Randy, when it comes to trying to fight misinformation, paper ballot versus electronic, is it more difficult for a board member's position to try to fight the misinformation, one versus the other?
I don't think so. Obviously with paper ballots, there is a trail that's right there, but even when we had direct entry equipment, there was a paper trail associated with that. I don't think there's a big problem with that in terms of misinformation.
Good to hear. Voter lists and list maintenance. How is that done? Is there a process for looking at that in a certain period of time after every election cycle? Who would like to address something like that?
The expert.
The experts? Okay, go ahead.
List maintenance is something we do all the time. Every day we are doing some sort of list maintenance. Maybe we get notification that a voter moved from Brunswick County to Hanover County, or we get notification that a near relative of a voter has passed away, and they've given us a form saying we can remove that voter. That's list maintenance. We do have routine list maintenance that happens monthly. We get reports from the State Board of Elections to notify us of voters that have passed away. So that comes from the State Department of Health and Human Services. We get reports that alert us to people that have been convicted of a felony and they will no longer be eligible to vote because they're in prison. We get potential lists from the state for possible duplicates, somebody in our county and another county, maybe everything's not matching up. So we're continuously doing list maintenance. We also do national change of address with the postal service. Twice a year, we are sending a big mailing to anyone that notified the postal service that they moved to try to get confirmation of that and get the address updated. And then anyone that's not caught in one of those more traditional and routine list maintenance cycles, we do a big list maintenance every 2 years that helps us hopefully clean the rolls of anybody that kind of got left behind.
We've had a couple of questions here along the same thought process. So I guess I'm in a bigger umbrella as far as enforcement is concerned. Ray, I'm gonna go to you. What steps are in place to try to catch, if that's the proper term, or find someone who tries to vote twice, someone who tries to vote for someone who is deceased, someone who tries to, sidestep the process and vote, let's call it illegally, and go there. Outline, if you can, for me, what is in place in your office, and I don't know, Sarah, if you have any additions, but what's in place to try to identify someone who's trying to skirt the law?
I'll start with the first scenario, which is someone who tries to vote twice. So when an individual turns out to vote, whether they're voting absentee by mail, they vote at one stop, we have a record linked to their sort of unique ID or their voter registration number. So we then see another ballot or another voter history record come through for that voter. Our system will catch it when we go into reconciliation between election day and canvass. If we find instances of double voting, we will report that to the state board for investigation. So there are those safeguards in place. A particular voter cannot have two duplicate history records for an election. Now, in terms of someone who presents to vote and is pretending to be someone else, obviously, as Sarah mentioned before, whether you're signing a voter registration form or you're signing sort of an authorization to vote form, which would be what you sign when you turn out to vote, or something similar at one stop, you're attesting that you are that specific individual. And that's going to be, to violate that as another class I felony. So, there is a system. The other thing that can happen is, we do have a voter challenge process. Do you know that if someone's saying, hey, that person doesn't look like so-and-so, and I know so-and-so, a voter can be challenged, and their absentee ballot or their vote itself can be challenged.
What's the process for someone who is, hey, that guy says he's Bill, he's not Bill, I know Bill. What's the process if someone wants to challenge?
Essentially what they would do is they would initiate a voter challenge. And so we sort of educate and train our chief judges and judges what to do. Typically, if it's a voter challenge on election day, they'll kind of go through, they'll look at the information, and they typically will reach out to us first, and we immediately reach out to the state board because it's a very delicate situation. You certainly don't want to prevent an eligible voter from casting a ballot, but you also don't want to just disregard someone making a sort of an accusation, so to speak. So in that case, they would take all the information, they take the guidance from the state board, and they would make a determination with the chief judge and both judges about what the appropriate action would be. So if that does happen, someone just say, oh, wait a minute, I just heard them say there's so-and-so who lives at this address. And if that's not the case, then they can certainly speak up and challenge the ballot.
And county board of elections meetings, state board of elections meetings are public. Anyone who wants to see that process unfold can see that by attending a local board of elections meeting, where some of those things may be heard, the state board of elections meeting as well. So these challenges and these reviews are done in public. So it's not something that's done behind closed doors, correct, Randy?
That is correct. All of our meetings are open to the public, and in 2020, we had 8 cases where there were challenges involved, and they were referred to the state, and that was all in the public meeting. Just one other point I'd like to make about folks trying to vote twice. In Brunswick County, we have an electronic poll books system, and we have 5 early voting locations. And from the time somebody checks in and says register to vote for that particular day, the computers have updated across the county to indicate that that person has voted within 20 to 25 minutes. And you can't go from one early voting location in Brunswick County to another one fast enough to be able to get there before the computer gets updated. So that's one of the checks and balances we have in place.
Speaking of the early voting sites, you can see the early voting sites near you inside the story of wect.com that I wrote last week. So if you're concerned about where you can vote early in Brunswick and Hanover, Columbus, Clayton, Pender, that's all that information they sent out in news releases to us. We posted on our website as well. So all of that information, all the information on days, times, locations is all right there at a place where people can find. Boyd, are the election observer rules any different? Have they been updated and or changed?
Chair could probably tell you, that observers it's a difficult process because we have observers that want to get into the middle of the process and they have to be beyond the process and not interfere with the process. And it's a challenge, but for the most part, the observer process, yeah, no, it was.
If a vote has been cast electronically, can that vote be changed or deleted by an administrator? Jennifer?
No. Not without proper authority. So if there were a ballot challenge and the board says, yes, that challenge is the same, that vote should not be counted, then we go and remove it, but it's not as simple as going in and finding it and removing it. We actually have to, find the physical ballot and manually remove it in our vote tabulation software, which does leave a trail, so it's not like we can just go in and start pulling ballots to remove. No, that's not how it works.
Randy or Boyd, when you're sitting across the table from a fellow board member, do you see political party?
Absolutely not. As we had mentioned before, I've been on the board for 9 years. Boyd was there when I came. In the entire time that I've been on the board, we have been bipartisan, nonpartisan. We have tried to do what is right by the law and what is right for the voters in Brunswick County. And in the 9 years, we've had one issue where we differed on a political basis, and that's Sunday voting. And that'll probably won't change again. So.
Thank you, Randy. We look at hundreds of voter intent whenever we get a ballot and we have to hand out there. And we always can resolve voter intent. If the mark is somewhere close, mark a box and X out another box, we can always agree that what voter intent can do. I think that's the most important thing, voter intent. And as far as partisan politics, when we go to work, it's all in the best interest of the voters of North Carolina and the Brunswick County, and it has nothing to do with partisan issue.
We have just about 2 minutes left here. Ray, I'm going to ask you first. What's one thing you want voters to know ahead of early voting starting and ahead of November 8th election day?
I think that I want voters to know that they can be 100% confident that when they pass that ballot, it will be counted correctly. You know, all county boards have to extensively test their voting equipment before it's used in an election. We make certain that all of the ballots are maintained in a secure environment, the voting equipment is maintained in a secure environment. We work with our election officials to train them so that they're there to assist the voter when they do turn out to vote. And so I know there's a lot of misinformation out there that can lead voters to maybe doubt, you know, if their ballots are going to be counted correctly. And I just want to, you know, hopefully assure you that everything has been done that you can be 100% confident that you're going to be counted correctly.
Sarah, I'm going to ask you the same question.
So this is probably for voters that would not be at an event like this.
Right.
I wish every voter would check their registration before they go vote. Make sure they're on the books, make sure they're registered at their current address. Make sure they don't need to update anything, because when a voter shows up, for early voting, it's not so difficult, we can make updates that way, but if they go on election day and they haven't checked their registration, they may not be able to vote, they may not be registered. Or they may be in the wrong county, and so I think the number one tip is everybody should check their registration before they go vote.
Randy, what's one thing you'd want the voting public and the public at large to know ahead of early voting and ahead of November 8th election?
Well, just that all of our meetings are open to the public. There are many, many meetings where we might have one or two ladies from the League of Women Voters, are the only ones in the county to show up. We do appreciate them being there. We do have an absentee ballot meeting tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the Brunswick County
Cooperative Extension Training.
Cooperative Extension Training Room. Anybody that's here is welcome to show up and watch the process. And be reassured that their votes are being counted correctly.
Boyd, you get the last word. What's one thing you want the voting public to know ahead of early voting and election day?
I think the voters of this state should know that every vote is counted correctly. As long as the process is in their hands, there's no compromise. When a ballot leaves us and it goes to, it's mailed to a resident or something, if it comes back, we assume that it's voted correctly. It's a price to pay if it's not, as somebody said, it's a penalty to law. But somebody asked me the other day, I told them I spent 30 years in property taxes. And we have a system for correcting errors. It's called a release if the taxes had been paid, a refund or a discovery if it needed to be billed. And somebody asked me to compare that to board elections. There's no room for error in the election process. There are errors, but there's an error. The whole process stops. Everything is put on hold until whatever that error is found and corrected to the satisfaction of the state board elections and the whole process. So I think everybody can have confidence that we have a fair, competent, and accurate election process in North Carolina.
Ladies and gentlemen, Boyd Williamson, Randy Pelton, Sarah Levier, and Ray Hoffman, sticking around the front. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. And we tried to get to all the questions. I apologize if I did not get to yours. We had a pretty good stack of them asked, but we do have another panel coming up, so maybe we can have the second panel address some of them. We're going to move on, and our next part of our program tonight, there are not any questions that will be asked because this cybersecurity section is going to be on video. Tory Crafts is the Chief Information Security Officer for the North Carolina State Board of Elections. He's on a contract from Woodstar Labs, a subsidiary of AUI Incorporated. He oversees the agency security program and he's a security liaison. He's been with the information technology industry for nearly 25 years with a career focus on cybersecurity. He's considered a subject matter expert in infrastructure, operations, and security, with demonstrated leadership at work and within the community. We're going to have, ladies and gentlemen, Tory Crafts on cybersecurity.
I want to introduce now Tory Crafts, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for the North Carolina State Board of Elections on a contract through Woodstar Labs. It's a subsidiary of AUI Corporation. It's overseeing an agency security program and security liaison for partner entities. He's been in the information technology industry for nearly 25 years with a strong career focus on cybersecurity. The past decade is considered a subject matter expert in infrastructure, operations, and security, demonstrating leadership both at work and within the community. Tory, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, and glad to be here. Is this like a wild time of year for you, or is it wild all the time? I wish I could say it's just wild time this part of the year. It's more wild. How's that?
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Coming up on November, so it's definitely a busy one right now.
Yeah, no question about it. Let's start broadly at first.
the amount of that goes into security for state board elections and the states and elections. Tell us a little bit about what is behind that and the scope of what we're talking about here. So in terms of cybersecurity in particular, we're really working on setting up and identifying ways to monitor and get information about what's going on networks, and make sure that our controls and our think of it as antivirus programs, and those things are up to date, in place, ready to make sure that constantly all the systems related to elections are secure and properly monitored, so that the infrastructure that we have at Board of Elections can actually be up and functioning on election day and working for all of us. And I think one key aspect with cybersecurity as an approach is looking at it as a program, not just a one-off single instance where you get a phishing email, right? So we all get those. It's unfortunate as that is, right? So instead of working towards solving that one single phishing issue, we're really focused on creating a program that takes into account all the different aspects of cybersecurity that we need to pay attention to at an organization level, from the equipment, from the software, from the people, from the connectivity around this entire ecosystem, and just make sure that cybersecurity is the focus, and that we're always driving toward improving that however we can, because the threats are constantly evolving, they're changing, so we need to have a program that adapts with those changes as well.
I was going to ask you about that because they're always changing and evolving. What types of threats does the state face the most when it comes to security?
That's a hard one. So I would say it varies a little bit with what's going on in the greater realm of IT. So for instance, one thing that came out now, it's been a while, the Log4j vulnerability that has caught so many headlines over the past, I think, year plus at this point, or something like that. That was something that we're always watching for, those vulnerabilities that are going to come out, because when something like that happens, we're not sitting around idle. We're going back, checking our systems, making sure that the software that's in use on the different platforms doesn't have that vulnerability, and heaven forbid if something does actually have that vulnerability, we're going through and installing updates, making corrective actions, so that way those vulnerabilities cannot affect the systems that BOE uses. And also making sure that the counties and the folks that state board of elections support are also aware of those vulnerabilities and have whatever guidance and support that we can provide them.
How quickly has, with technology, this changed, and then how have the last few years, impacted that with the questions about it from the outside as well?
I think it's rapid, super fast pace of change. So you look at just in terms of what we were concerned about, say 5 years ago. Ransomware was new, right? Like it wasn't something that was as prevalent as it is today. You constantly see, if you look at tech headlines at all, ransomware dominates those headlines. And 5 years, maybe a little bit further back than that, it didn't at all. So we're constantly looking at that from a what's over the horizon, what's the next thing that we need to try and pay attention to. And there's a lot of partnership aspects to that, where we engage with as much as we can local county IT groups to understand what's going on at their level, as well as at the federal level through DHS and CISA and FBI Secret Service. Whoever has good information to help us adapt to that technical landscape as it continues to move forward. And from a challenge standpoint, it's been super challenging because of how many things are changing. Everybody's evolving products, they're making them better, right? That's a huge plus for all of us. We're constantly making IT improvements as an industry. That also means that there has to be constant security fixes, constant work to improve security to go along with those brand new tools and brand new programs. And elections is not the least of that, especially when we look at elections as a whole. So a lot of folks, they show up to the polls, they cast their vote, and then they go home, right? That's how we vote. For Board of Elections, that's not the case. We're working year round, so it is really a day job. It's an office just like everybody else's, where there's people working on answering emails, answering phones, handling records, and making improvements to those types of things.
All right, so let's get into some of the, and if I can see someone kind of asking about it already, some of the questions that come up about this. So first, can someone hack into a voting machine, flash drive, etc.? Can someone do that?
So the question I normally ask on this is, has anybody seen the DEFCON voting village videos of voting machines being hacked? So I think, you know, they're out there on the internet. The answer is yes, they can be, but that's not to say that the voting machines that we have in place can be. You have to look at it in the context of what we're talking about. So the voting machines that were in place at the voting village, and in full context, I'm at DEFCON every year, and the voting village is a stop on my way through that security conference. So I go through, and I'm constantly looking to see what is going on in that space, to see what I need to bring back and what we need to work on. So one of the things important to the hacking a voting machine conversation is that a lot of those machines are old, they're outdated, and probably not in use anymore. Most states have done away with those. Unfortunately, I think there's still a couple of states that use some of the machines out there that have been found to be vulnerable, but that's one part of the conversation. The other part, and in many ways almost the more important part, is that there's so many controls around those pieces of equipment. So you have to look at the audits that take place before those machines get used on voting day, as well as after they get used post elections, and they're tested rigorously before they're ever put into to make sure that the data that goes in is going to end up being valid when it comes out the other side of the voting machine in any of that equipment. In addition to that, there's physical controls around that. So it's not like even I could walk in to a facility and just pick up a voting machine, open it up, and do things with that. There's tight physical controls around that. There's tamper evidence seals on those pieces of equipment, so it's known whether or not somebody's actually opened those systems. So there's a lot of different controls that are in place to prevent the ability for somebody to hack a voting machine by actually even preventing physical access to it. And also, even on election day, there's people watching that. There's folks at the polls that are paying attention and making sure that no one's tampering with equipment and things of that sort.
Just to be clear, the machine that you're talking about that most states aren't using, North Carolina is not using any of those machines, or they are?
North Carolina is not using the ballot marking devices that have been shown to play doom, or some of the videos that you'll see in those videos on YouTube and whatnot.
Okay. The other question about county and state websites where voting tallies are reported. What about the security level and the ability to potentially be hacked?
So if I think the important thing to note there is that those systems are separate. So for instance, if you were to if you take Board of Election, State Board of Election website, so ncsb.gov, that website is actually hosted on completely different infrastructure with completely different access. So even in the event that somebody is able to do something to that website, and of course there's controls around that. There's security monitoring, there's security protections, there's folks watching that stuff 24/7. So when there are attempts that are happening there, they're getting seen. In the event that someone were to be able to do something in that space, that system is completely separate and I guess in a way isolated from, or the better way to look at it is the systems that are responsible for recording election results and storing that data are completely isolated from everything else. So there's no public access to those. There's no internet public facing connection that could be made to those, to where someone could end up breaking into those the same way that you could see with a website replacement or something like that.
One of the questions on here was, and I'm curious about kind of related to this, that would it be possible for the Russians, for instance, to change the outcome of the election by hacking into our state DOE website? That's another one of those. Go ahead.
So I think that's one that I can start to answer that one, but I think that actually even plays more into the election administration piece of it, because it speaks to those controls and the audit activities that go on with elections beyond even the technical footprint. So the technical footprint is very secured, locked down, isolated, and it's heavily monitored. So on election day, for instance, there's 40 or so people that are helping with cybersecurity through partnerships and whatnot at state levels, and we built these partnerships to allow us to have more eyes on glass, so to speak. So people are watching these screens, monitoring these events, and identifying where there is anything that might constitute something concerning, and then we can look into it and address it if the need arises. So I think that's one component of it, but then you look at what if the level of effort that it would take to change something like that and get around all of the different controls, not just the technical controls, but the audit activities, again, somehow manipulating things before and after on the voting machine side, and then having to figure out how to manipulate the data as it's somehow in that system, and then having that match all the rest of the data in the ecosystem. It's just not feasible. It's just not really practical for them to do that. Not saying they couldn't change one thing here, one thing there, but could they change it en masse? Could they do something? Could they break into the system and get the ability to do that? It's not worth their time, not worth their effort, and for the amount of effort that it would take for them to do that.
You know, there's still talk sometimes about, hey, should we, be able to vote on the internet or by our phones in the future? Is that even possible then, based on this?
So I don't think it's something that we're going to see anytime soon. And then a lot of that comes back to trust, right? So you have to trust the system that you're using to cast your vote on. So right now, those mobile devices and using your phone is not really reliable. How do you audit that particular device? Keeping in mind that right now, from an elections perspective, the machines that you're using are very tightly controlled. Not only that, but they're actually certified. And in North Carolina, they're certified extra, essentially. So you have one set of certifications that comes down through the federal government that says we've certified these, you can use these voting systems. And then North Carolina, before those machines can be used by the counties, North Carolina does a separate certification process for them as well. So when we're talking about devices being used in an election, they're very heavily controlled. They're very thoroughly gone through and looked at very closely before they ever get to use in an election. Whereas your mobile phone right now, that's not the case, and that's a little bit harder to do in terms of you don't have the same controls in place around that. So I think it becomes a much more challenging discussion to get people to trust that those devices cannot be manipulated because they don't have controls around it the same way that election systems today do.
I'm just going through the questions here. There are some questions about inside the machines. We've heard that before too, and trusting the people that are around these machines. What for people that have concerns about that? What would you tell them?
So I think that starts with the fact that the staff that's employed year round, we're all nonpartisan. We're required to be nonpartisan in order to have our jobs. So our function and our goal is to ensure that the equipment and the technology being used in these elections, regardless of where that is safe and secure, and that it's up and running and available for everybody on election day. We want you to vote. We want you to get out there and cast your vote and let your voice be heard. We want to be able to support that in a nonpartisan way. So I think that's the first step, is realizing that staff is nonpartisan. And then I think when you start looking at, and I'm sure, I hope this will come up through election administration and maybe the other section as well. A lot of the folks at the county levels are your friends and neighbors, right? So they're folks who have volunteered to step up and put their time in to help with the election process and help make this possible for all of us to go out and cast our votes. So they're people who are deeply concerned about the integrity of the election and making sure that it's put on without partisan divides, so that everyone can have a voice that's heard in our democracy. It's foundational principle of it, right?
Are we doing everything we can to make sure that there aren't some of these issues that we brought up today? Or, and this is a loaded question, or does the legislature need to put more money in so that we can get better security or whatever? Are we doing everything we can today? What's your wish list?
So I would be remiss if I said that we were at a level that we wanted to be at funding wise. We're not there. That doesn't mean that we're not doing everything we can with what we have available to us. And we've had really good partnerships with security vendors, really good partnerships with supporting entities that give us support, that help us make this possible. But the reality is, we would like to see more funding. It would help with stability. It would help with long-term upgrades. It would help us to drive more confidence in the election process. Again, it's what I think anyhow.
Some people are saying we should just go back to paper ballots, right? Get rid of all the technology. I know that's not your job necessarily. Is that what would you say, Rose?
So again, definitely a good question to carry over to the next group. I think that the main thing that I see from a technology standpoint is the technology. Part of the reason why you get same day election results, where you for instance, Tim, can comment on this stuff on election day, is because of that technology. It gives us the ability to do things faster, more efficiently, more accurately, actually. So you start to use good technology in the right ways, and it can have a very positive effect. Not saying that there shouldn't be scrutiny over it, and there should. There should be scrutiny, there should be oversight, there should be controls around it. But the technology gets used to enable us to do bigger, better things, and to really further our ability to conduct elections efficiently. And you just mentioned budgets and cost savings and things like that. These are much more efficient ways to do that. So you're spending a lot less people and hands and eyes to go through a lot of these different things. So, in some ways, it does have some cost benefit to using this type of equipment.
Or we have other sections we get to.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's Tim Boyum of Spectrum News and Tori Cross talking about cybersecurity. And I know many of you may have questions. If we can, if any of our legal experts might be able to handle some of those, we could try to get those answered as well. I'm going to bring up our two panelists for our election law part of the program. Bob Orr, you've met already, served in the U.S. Army. His Juris Doctorate at the University of North Carolina School of Law, appointed to the Court of Appeals in 1986, elected to the State Supreme Court in 1994, retired to head the newly formed at that time North Carolina Institute for Constitutional Law. Ladies and gentlemen, will you welcome Republican Bob Orr. And we have a UNC versus Duke battle here on the stage this evening. Jill Hoffman is a practicing immigration and human rights attorney, graduated from Duke University with degrees in political science and psychology, has specialized in voter protection and election issues for the Democratic Party since 2015. In 2020, she served as an at-large poll observer for New Hanover County, oversaw voter protection for Brunswick County, helped to lead the recount campaign for Chief Justice Terry Beasley, and testified on her behalf before the State Board of Elections. Will you please welcome Jill Hoffman? Jill, thank you very much for joining us. You are election law experts. So Jill, I'm going to ask you for the first response. What role do the courts play in the election system and keeping our elections safe and secure?
Well, courts have judicial oversight and get to review the laws that the state legislatures essentially enact. And they make sure that equal protection under the law and all voters have fair constitutional rights to vote.
Justice Orr?
I thought we were here to talk about basketball. Well, the courts are like the place of last resort. I mean, that you hope that any controversy, any problem is resolved through the administrative process, through your local board of elections, through your state board. But there is undoubtedly litigation, as Jill well knows, on the front end. I wish I had brought the book of laws, regulations. It's about 2 inches thick, right, ladies? I mean, you know, it is an extremely comprehensive set of statutes and regulations that control everything that the professionals do. But if there's a challenge, you know, before an election, you can end up in court. Sometimes on election day, you end up in court. Sometimes post-election, you know, the greatest example being Bush v. Gore that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the one thing I would want to emphasize is if there is a problem, there's a process. And we would encourage people, if you have a problem, go through the proper process to get it resolved.
If anybody has a question, Jennifer does have cards. You can raise your hand. We can try to get a question on election law answered. Justice Orr, Southeastern North Carolina became very familiar with ballot harvesting a couple of years ago with the NC9 controversy. Do you believe ballot harvesting will continue, or do you think it will be an issue moving forward in North Carolina? Or are there practices and standards in place because of what happened then to curtail that from happening again?
I certainly think the legislature has moved to tighten the laws on that kind of practice. And I would say that historically, and I know we have a lot of relatively new folks to North Carolina. I've lived here all my life, and so I've been involved in a lot of elections. And consistently, we get better and better and better, stronger in the security and the integrity of our elections. And ballot harvesting, I think you will see virtually none because of the improvements put in place, but also what happened? You go to jail, right? Is it worth it for 1 vote, 10 votes? Go to prison? And what happened in old NC9 is proof that the security system works and the legal system.
Jill, I'm going to ask you the same thing. That put North Carolina in the national spotlight for a long time and raised doubts on the election system. Do you concur with what Justice Orr said?
I do. I don't think that is as big of a problem here locally, but also the law has changed since then. So now where you used to be able to drop off, for example, a third-party ballot that's defined by statute, by as a near relative, your parent, your spouse, your child. In the past, it used to say essentially that somebody else outside of that could drop it off, where those votes shouldn't be counted. But now, anybody who is not specifically defined by statute is a class 1 felony to essentially return a ballot if you are not listed as a near relative or you are not the voter itself. So these laws against ballot harvesting have also been strengthened specifically to prevent this based on what happened
I'm gonna ask you, Jill, when there is doubt cast on paper ballots or on voter eligibility or on procedures, there are legal remedies. You have been an observer, you have worked in that side of elections. So can you talk to us about some of the challenges that you've seen and how the process played out, maybe that were successful and maybe those that were unsuccessful?
Sure, I mean, there's been sort of minor challenges, whether that is address discrepancies or a husband and a wife switching their ballot envelopes and mailing things in. There's also been larger challenges. Like was mentioned, I was part of the Beasley recount, and one of the biggest issues then, as I just said, was the third party ballot issue. In Brunswick County, for example, they accepted basically all of the third party ballots as long as the voter verified, yes, this was my pastor who dropped it off, or this was my professor. In New Hanover County, for example, they rejected almost all of them if it was not specifically defined. And at the time, that was the issue that I was concentrating on the most for the Beasley recount. And I did find a whole bunch of discrepancies between different counties and whatnot. But as we know, Beasley lost the recount and it was not successful overall, but it was a fascinating experience to see how the law was applied differently in different counties. But again, that's now been fixed because the law itself has changed.
Justice Orr?
Yeah, I want to commend Jill and those that work in elections or during, particularly when there's a challenge. It's intense pressure. There's a great deal of media scrutiny. There's a great deal of time pressure to get these things right. And as our election supervisors said, if there are problems, they're going to get it resolved before it's finalized. But you know, I think you do a great job, and I appreciate it. And I would say former Chief Justice Beasley lost 401 votes out of 5 million cast. You know, so we say every vote counts. That's a perfect example. I would commend former Chief Justice Beasley. She played out the process, recount, and then accepted the result.
Have the laws changed or been strengthened regarding chain of custody of ballots? Specifically, this person is asking about nursing home.
Well, and I'm talking now from what I've learned in doing 13 of these. What do you call your teams that go out to multi-partisan systems? Those are specific individuals that the local boards of elections send out to nursing facilities, places to assist people in being able to cast their ballot. And you know, unfortunately, historically, I think individuals in those kind of care facilities have been taken advantage of on occasion. And this is a great system that's been put in place to make sure that just because you're in a senior citizen facility or a nursing home, you're still going to have an opportunity to cast your ballot. They adjusted the process for assisting them. I don't have the answer to that, the experts. And I'll put this plug in, and again, I've learned this over the last 5 weeks. If you have questions, these are the experts, and they are more than willing, not just in Brunswick and New Hanover County, all across this state. Election officials have said, if you've got a concern, if you've got a question, come to us. We want to answer that question for you.
Go ahead, John.
I agree entirely. I'm just gonna repeat this plug because go to a board of elections meeting. It's fascinating to watch, but also it would be almost impossible for anything nefarious to happen there because these are such bipartisan teams that coordinate and compromise and work together, especially in New Hanover and Brunswick. And these multi-partisan, bipartisan. Can absolutely trust them. The election could not be more secure when women like these them are in charge of making sure it's administered properly.
Jill, should the voting public have concerns that the Secretary of State's office, the Attorney General's office, someone in state government can have an impact on the outcome of an election?
No, I don't really think so. Again, there's such bipartisan teams in place at every local board of elections, which is, you know, the bottom line where this starts and ends. That I believe that there are so many checks and balances in place. It would be very, very difficult in order to impact an election in that type of.
Yeah, North Carolina is different from some states. The Secretary of State has nothing to do with the election process. She's certified and issues a certificate after the State Board of Elections has certified the winners of the election. The Secretary of State of North Carolina doesn't have anything to do with it. The Attorney General's office doesn't have anything to do with it, other than providing an attorney to the State Board of Elections, or if there's a challenge to a state law that represents the state's interest in that. And so it really is unique. The State Board of Elections, 5-member entity created by the North Carolina General Statutes, is an independent body. It doesn't answer to Elaine Marshall, doesn't answer to Josh Stein, doesn't answer to Roy Cooper, doesn't answer to Phil Berger or Tim Moore. It's independent, and depending on who's the governor, the 5th member of the chairman is appointed by that governor of whatever political party. So Pat McCrory was governor, there were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats on the state board. Roy Cooper was governor, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. They worked together in the same nonpartisan way as you've heard the representatives from the local boards talk about.
I mean,
Go ahead,
in
Joe.
my challenge in 2020 before New Hanover County, which did have 3 Democrats, I still lost it, meaning it really is non-partisan in any way. So you can trust your local boards elections with your seen by the state board.
Justice Orr, does the federal government have any interaction at the state level with the State Board of Elections when it comes to laws or enforcement or anything of that nature?
Well, this is our federal expert here, so I make fun, you know, but I will say there are federal laws, you know, the Voting Rights Act, for example, that impact North Carolina laws. I think our experts at both the local, state level coordinate with Homeland Security, with the federal government to make sure that there aren't outside forces that are interfering with our election. So there is some coordination, but as was pointed out in one of our other events, we have 100 separate boards and 100 separate elections in North Carolina, the results of which are ultimately sent to the state board. But
So Jill, that contact between the federal government and the State Board of Elections doesn't usually happen?
No, not really. I mean, in terms of elections, the federal government enforces voter rights act, the Constitution itself, equal protection, but otherwise it's the state governments that are implementing and enacting and enforcing state election law.
We've heard about this several times this evening, several questions talked about it. Voter ID. There are several challenges, if I'm correct, several challenges still working their ways through the justice system. Jill, can you update us on where they stand?
Well, right now, we do not need to provide, as Hoffman mentioned, we don't need to provide ID in North Carolina, at least if you're not voting for the first time in the federal election. Very controversial on one hand. No, voter ID does ensure that the person who is voting is the person that they say that they are. On the other hand, as many studies show, it's much harder for a lot of people to access ID that are low income, minorities, elderly. And right now, after the referendum, this has been now overturned and has been put on hold by the recently the Superior Court the other day.
It's back to the Superior Court, but there's a separate challenge that is being argued at the state Supreme Court. But I'll put in my plug for reform. The challenge is because of the types of ID that's accepted. You know, those challenging the law say that it limits the ability of some people to vote. The solution, in my humble opinion, is for the General Assembly to appropriate money to issue a voter ID card to any and every voter in the state of North Carolina. The resources are there, capacity is there, and you solve the problem. And so I would encourage you to talk to your legislators about how do we solve voter ID. You simply issue one to every single voter in here. You don't worry about driver's license, food cards, student IDs, whatever else. You got a voter ID.
And it's often the documents you need to request the ID cards. You might need your social security card, you might need a birth certificate, and that is often what makes it harder to just go and get a driver's license, for example. And I do.
Can either of you address this question that we received? And it's a pertinent question because now, at least in New Hanover County, there are more unaffiliated voters than there are Republicans or Democrats. As I'm standing here today, I don't know the specifics for North Carolina, but I do know in New Hanover County, there are more unaffiliated. Why can't unaffiliated voters be represented on election boards? Can either of you address that?
I mean, this is, I have this argument all the time politically, join a party and you can join, be part of our team, essentially. But no, I do agree here, 40% of voters in New Hanover County are unaffiliated, and we definitely need to address them more specifically as a voting bloc, both as individual parties and as county overall.
Justice Orr?
There is a lawsuit pending in federal court. One of our panelists a few weeks ago, one of the lawyers representing unaffiliated voters. The state law says each party, Democrat, Republican, will nominate and have appointed to the state board 2 members from the Republican Party, 2 members from the Democrat Party. The chairman is appointed by the governor, which consistently is an individual of the governor's political party. There's no place that says in the law that says an unaffiliated voter can serve on the state board of elections, and that's being challenged in federal court. We'll see. I do think, for a plug-in, it would help, I think, strengthen voter confidence in the board's actions. It's not a Democrat majority board or Republican majority board, even though they may work in a nonpartisan way. It's still going to get reported. The 3 members, 3 Democrats voted this way, 2 Republicans voted this way. You have unaffiliated voters, arguably that.
One more question here before you run out of time. Are there contractors at the State Board of Elections that are being paid for by the federal government? Whether, as you know, either one of our directors know?
I do believe there are some employees that are being paid through HAVA, Help America Vote Act grants.
That makes sense.
Yes.
So would they have any impact on the process as a federal government employee or
Well,
being paid for? Sorry.
They're technically state board of elections employees. I believe that money gets allocated to the state board through the general assembly. I could be wrong on that. So they actually are employees of the state board of elections through the grant funding.
Justice Orr, I asked the panel prior for a final comment. I asked you first, what's one thing you want the voting public to know regarding election laws and election process in North Carolina before we go into early voting and on November 9th?
I have consistently heard from Asheville to Wilmington, from Democrat and Republican board members, from Democrat and Republican lawyers, that they consistently have confidence in how elections are run in the state of North Carolina. And I just pulled up a few minutes ago, WRAL in Raleigh had a poll in which 55% of registered Republicans did not have confidence that their vote would be counted properly in this coming election. I can assure you that it will. I'm gonna make one more plug, so you might time to
It's your program, it's not mine.
We have a fast growing state, and you live in one of the fastest growing areas in North Carolina. And the resources these local boards of elections need, both staffing, technology support, they're way behind where they need to be. And with the ever increasing number of people voting, we all want, they need support and help. So I encourage you to talk to your county commissioners, your legislators. It has nothing to do with party politics. It has everything to do with good government, fair, safe, and secure election.
Jill, you get the last word. What would you want the voting public to know before early voting and November the 8th?
Well, I agree with everything that Bob just said. And I will echo everything that's been said, that the state, that elections here are secure. But what I feel like hasn't been mentioned is we tell people to vote all the time, where to vote, when to vote, that they must vote. But we do not explain how to vote or how to properly fill out that ballot often. And just to go back to the Beasley recount, the amount of ballots that could have been saved if signatures were in the right place, if bubbles were filled in legibly, if all of your address information was properly, she probably would have won, quite frankly, if just those ballots alone could have been saved. So when you are helping your friends, your neighbors, when you are voting, make sure that you give all required information, that you sign in all the right places, that your intent is clear on your ballot. Because they will, the board of elections will do everything that they can to ensure that every lawful vote counts and voter intent is upheld. But it's your job as a voter to make sure all of that information is conveyed. Or there's no point, because it won't count anyway. So if you're going to take the time, do it correctly.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jill Hoffman and Ballot. I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Jennifer. Thank you for asking me to be a part of this. It was an honor to be with all of these esteemed panelists this evening. Thank you.
Did a fabulous job. Let's give John Evans a big hand. I'm sure that we're gonna make the evening news, of course, right? That's why we're taking the top story tonight. Our election experts are working every day to help make sure our democracy works. And what Jill said at the end is absolutely true. Each one of us can help spread this message. There are still skeptics and deniers out there. We want them to trust the system. Come observe, come work a poll, come sign up to be an election worker, right? We need election workers, we need young people especially, right? Absolutely, get people started and legal and voters is a great job educating people. We have a complicated state because we're growing so fast. Our lines keep changing. We need to help everyone we can be part of our democracy. Everyone here tonight can be part of that. Please share this on the website nctrustelections.com. If you go to the online one, the link is there for that whole video you saw of Tori. You can also watch election experts and lawyers, Michael Dickerson from Mecklenburg County. That is online available. Please share that. If people are willing to sit through 90 minutes, please let them do that. We want transparency. We want democracy. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful week.